not what I want. Okay. Can someone confirm that they are seeing the slide deck?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So you should have access to the slides and to the rolling notes. And I want to start by, on behalf of the co-chairs who are off doing interesting things right now and can't join us, I want to thank you for joining the GORC International Model Working Group here at RDA 18. I want to start by acknowledging with respect the Lokwigan peoples on whose traditional territory I stand, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Masonic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue on to this day. As you probably just noted, we are recording this session. RDA tells me that the recordings will be up on the website within 48 hours, and then after they'll be available, I think, for 4 weeks, and then they're going to be transferred over to the YouTube channel. So you'll be able to see this as well as the repeat sessions of this working group on here or on YouTube later on. So the agenda today is to talk a bit about what's going on at RDA 18, recap the decisions from the previous meetings, and give you an update on some of the homework I had, an update on tags, and an update on the e-infra standard, which some of you probably are far more familiar with than I am. And then a proposal about what we're hoping to do for the next steps of the working group. And by the way, feel free to interrupt me. I can't see anybody's chat. So feel free to jump in right now. My screen's a bit full. But if I can't see anything in the chat, there's going to be plenty of time at the end for an open discussion where we'll be able to talk. But so just so you know where we are, this is a regular working group meeting. We decided that this being the 5th meeting of the working group, we didn't need to do anything particularly different. We just needed to go ahead and make progress through the working group itself. So we are here just having the next iteration of the working group. This is the first repeat of the session. We had a session this time yesterday. This time zone is quite good for certain time zones, but not as good for our European colleagues. So we've added a 3rd repeat session on Tuesday, November 9th at 1600 UTC. So just in case there are some folks that couldn't make it to these sessions. Yep. So from the September meeting, we had made collectively a set of decisions that we would create a set of tags to begin characterizing the Zotero resources, and Alicia can drop a link to the Zotero resources in case you haven't seen them yet. We have some growing bibliography of literature related to the GORCs that we're going to be reviewed. And we had decided that we would use tags for the geographic region, the domain, and the e-infra standard as we review those resources. And that I would present about an overview of the e-infra classification here, which I'll do in just a minute. We also decided that we were going to recruit speakers to describe an initial set of commons in a set of working group meetings, and Francoise Geneva, I'm sure I'm saying that poorly, Genevois, is slated to talk to us about the IVOA in November. We confirmed that with her yesterday, so that's definitely happening. November, I think, is 25th, the last Thursday in November. And one of our co-chairs, Mark, has reached out to our Chinese counterparts to make sure that they have access to snapshots and versions of a Martyr document that we've started working on. And again, Alicia can drop a link to the Martyr document there. For those of you who don't know that word, it's a straw man document. It's meant to be messy and take all comers, and feel free to type up whatever you're feeling about how we should approach this work, or the narrative document more general. So it really is meant to be an all comers kind of document. And so that's open, and we'll talk a bit more about how we're going to shape that going forward. As I said, during the September meeting, we decided to create a set of tags for those Zotero resources. It's also true that these tagging systems, or these classification systems that we're going to talk about, could also be useful as we shape the Martyr document, as we shape the paper that's going to come out of this group, or as we organize ourselves, perhaps into subgroups or task groups. So there's multiple purposes here, and different levels of the tags could be used at different classification levels. So the first one we wanted to look at is the domains or the areas of research. And for this, we've used an OECD list of domains. And we created 6 tags for the highest level of sort of research areas. And there are certainly many subgroups of this, but this is the high level tags that we've created for the Zotero instance. We're using the UN Statistics Division's scheme for world regions. We've implemented up to 3 different levels of tags for that. So the top level being Africa, Americas, Europe, Oceania, Asia, and Antarctica. There's a second level to that for all of those, well, not for Antarctica, but for all except Antarctica. And then for the Americas and Africa, there's a third level regions below that. And certainly below that, we could go down to the national or territory level as well. But these are the first set of tags that we created for the geographic regions. The GORC topology is evolving. Many of you probably saw the infographic on the left, which had 6 different terms that are part of the GORC topology: the governance, stakeholders, software, data, compute, and sustainability. That topology is being developed, and right now it's being split into core elements, software, data, and infrastructure, and a suite of supporting elements. Distinct from the first infographic, the supporting elements are now including human capacity, rules of participation, and standards and interoperability. So the Australian Research Data Commons communications folks are working on making this into a pretty image, somehow conveying the pillars of the GORC topology, but that's where it currently stands. We have a set of 6 tags based on the original topology, but we can upgrade that based on this new topology. It's just being presented here in the interest group session, and there will be a repeat of the interest group session, I believe on the 9th or 10th. That I have to look at my schedule, but they will be held next week if you're interested in that. The e-infra tags are coming from a standard created by e-infra Central to create service catalogs for infrastructures. And again, most of you probably already know the really famous implementation of this comes from the European Marketplace, the European Open Science Cloud Marketplace. But it's also being used by the CATRIS project and also by OpenAir as well. It's a classification scheme that's designed to catalog the main entities that are managed within a research infrastructure. And it includes services and users, providers, and KPIs. So it's really quite robust, and I think a really nice piece of work that I think could help really shape our discussions about clouds and commons going forward. Version 2 of the standard, this data model or this metadata template was referred to as a service description template. And version 3, they're now called Eos Profiles. And I do know that they're actively working on version 4. But these are quite separate from the specifications for architecture. That's not what this is. This is really about describing just the services that you can access through the marketplace. So the e-infra Central, the Eos profile is divided essentially into 2 sections. It's one document in 2 sections. The first section on the left-hand side describes the provider and who is providing the resource and who's providing the metadata record. And then on the right-hand side is the resource profile, and that describes the resource or the service that's being that you can get access to through the marketplace. So we were particularly interested in this classification, this number 3, this classification category, which is how they classified the resources that were made available, the research infrastructure services. And so I'll talk you through that in just a minute. I also thought it was interesting to note that there is a dependencies information that's interesting, not only because it talks about, it asks the provider to note any services that are dependent on other services, but also services that are used oftentimes or commonly in conjunction with other services. And I think that's really could be interesting in terms of interoperability going forward, and how people use these commons platforms. So the version 3 of the eInfra standard has 6 super categories and 20 categories, and then a whole lot of subcategories. And so the 6, so we have tags at the top level: access and physical infrastructure, sharing and discovery, processing and analysis, security, training and support, and aggregators and integrators. And so these I think are really good sort of catch-all bins for describing services that are commonly found in commons architectures. So as I said, in addition, each of the 20 categories have a suite of subcategories. So for example, just this part of the access, physical, and e-infrastructure super categories has a set of categories: material storage, network, and others, and a small definition here, and then the suite of the types of subcategories that you would find in each of those categories. And we'll talk a bit about how these subcategories, I think there was a good suggestion that we made in the working group yesterday that I think there's a good way that we could use these going forward. I would also note that as part of registering a resource within the EOS catalog, there's a whole suite of steps for registering as a provider and getting all the information for the provider to register the service. But what I think is interesting is that the provider also is required to provide a performance indicator or any metrics of user engagement with the service that the provider collects. And so again, if we think back on the charter for this working group, one of our goals was to collect features or attributes that are common across commons or clouds, but also KPIs and engagement metrics that service providers are using. And so having this explicitly part of the service catalog, I think is really smart and really helpful going forward. So those are the 4 sets of tags. These are just to recap. I'm going to pause here for discussion. If you or there's in the notes documents, please feel free to add your comments about these tags. They'll probably expand or contract as we actually start reviewing the literature that's there. But I'm just going to pause for 1 second and see if there's any comments that anybody wants to make before I move on to our next steps and a proposal for how we're going to go forward. I will take your silence as complete agreement with everything that we say, which is nice. So in terms of the next steps, we had agreed in the September call that we would recruit speakers to describe commons in a series of working group meetings, and that we wanted to begin shaping this narrative martyr document. And what we thought could be useful is that as we invite speakers to talk about their commons, we should generate a common list of questions that we would like the speakers to address. And in particular, I think what we're leaning towards, if the group agrees, is creating a set of questions that can be associated with different aspects of the topology. So we'd like to see the commons described according to the topology of the commons that was created by the interest group. And I think part of that is in no small part because some of the eInfra tags are really great, but they really don't cover the governance models and the rules of participation and all those sorts of things that are necessary to make a commons really work. So those eInfra tags are really useful in terms of knowing what types of services are available, but it's really the topology that reaches into all corners, I think, of the commons. And so one of the things that we started doing yesterday, and I'm hoping I'll stop here in a minute and we'll start some brainstorming, but one of the things we started doing yesterday was just brainstorming and generating a list of questions that you would like to ask the speakers, or we could pose to the speakers as a way to prompt them as they create their presentations about their commons to us. The idea is that we're going to put together a speaker packet and say, approach people informally first and ask them if they will talk to us about their comments, and then say, in particular, these are some of the questions that we have about it. I'm also really conscious of the fact that folks that come to speak to us, it takes time out of their day, and I like to be prepared for that, and I'd like to be a well-prepared audience. And so I would like to review the documents that we have about each of the commons prior to the speakers coming on. And so their first speaker is going to be Francoise from the IBOA. And I have volunteered to read what I can about the IBOA documents. And if there's anybody in there who would like to help me with that, feel free to let me know, and we can divvy up some of the documents that we have found that are either inside the Zotero documents or inside the Zotero set or aren't there yet. But I do think it's important to review some of the public facing literature before the speakers get there. It helps to form the discussion. The other thing that we were talking about doing yesterday was, as part of this invitation to the speaker packet, was taking those subcategories, and I'll move back up if I can. That taking these subcategories as a checklist to the commons. So say one of the ideas was that we could create as a checklist and say, which of these services does your organization provide? And are there any others that you do not feel are represented here that you currently provide? So it's a nice jumping off point. I realize it's, very, very much building on the good work that the Europeans have done in terms of representing the infrastructure. So doing this, creating a set of questions, a common set of questions, helps us shape the information gathering that we're getting from across the commons, doing our homework, and then asking the commons to sort of tell us more in a very sort of structured way about the services they provide. I think could help us really move this narrative document forward as we compare the different commons. We are looking currently, the preliminary list of commons was about 16 different commons. There have been some suggestions about others that we might want to add for various reasons. And I'm certainly open to that idea. I do think that given the timeline of the working group, reviewing all 16 commons is going to take most of our time between that and actually creating the deliverables from this. But this is where we are now, and we may choose to prioritize these and or expand on these or retract on these. This is actually a much reduced set from the original charter from the working group. Was much more expansive, and this was a reduced set that felt like it could be potentially doable in that time. So I am going to stop my sharing there, and then I'm going to open up the floor for discussion. Everyone should have access to the rolling notes, and feel free to add comments there if you don't have anything. But I'd first like to just ask your general impression about where we are and maybe the path forward, and if anyone's got any comments that they'd like to share.
And there's a question from Christina in the chat.
Yes, thank you. International data spaces frameworks coming out of Gaia X. So it's interesting. Gaia X came up yesterday, and it is on our list of the preliminary repositories, or no, sorry, not repositories, preliminary clouds that we might want to review. So we are seeing them as a fairly commercial heavy cloud infrastructure. But beyond that, I don't know a lot about GaiaX. And if there's something, Christina, you want to talk about, I'm not familiar with the data spaces. If there's something you want to enlighten me about, I'm all ears.
I'm happy to chime in, and I feel very new to this particular group. So I'm hesitant just because I'm learning so much about your work. But the work I do, so I'm a program officer for an OA ebook usage data trust effort that is looking at how we can pull together some of the usage data. You think of that in terms of impact factor KPIs, and how to do that across platforms and services. And so I'm trying to think about how what we're looking at with respect to these international data space frameworks. The thing that's useful is there's a reference architecture framework that has come out of those GaiaX projects that is in its third version right now that really talks about how to tie together these different services. And so I feel like there may be a crosswalk or connection point somewhere. But again, I'm just kind of coming up to speed to what this group is doing. That might be worth looking at if nothing else, because there's a reference architecture framework as well as a data rulebook. But I think that reference architecture framework might be the right place to start. I'll see if I can dig up a link in the background.
That would be great. Yeah, if you can put up a link and put it in the rolling notes, and we'll be sure to add that to the Zotero instance. I appreciate that. Adrian, your hand's up.
Yes, so acknowledging that Andrew, my colleague, is one of the co-chairs here, I just obviously like to emphasise how relevant this is to our work in Australia at the Australian Research Data Commons. Just pause because I was going to just comment on what Christina was talking about. We are also reaching out to the International Data Spaces Association to just check whether some of the things in that architecture might inform some of our own work. Particularly, it's the safe data space is, what it's talking about is a safe data space for business to business data exchange, which probably isn't where you'd start for a research data commons. However, the research to industry interface is a really important one for us for lots of reasons. So just sort of informing our own models with something that industry that's come out of industry that is obviously a model that certain industries have found comfortable is good for us, because we obviously want to have industry partners comfortable with our own research data commons. So we've been looking at it quite seriously, the IDSA, to sort of see how we might be able to inform our own work from that. Now, it's not a lot different, and there's a session on next Friday in the RDA called something about exploring data spaces, and it mentions an Eos speaker as well. So maybe that's be another spot to see how other people have been teasing out the potential linkage there.
That's great.
As Christina said, it's a very mature thing. They probably had about 6 years of conceptual research into the idea, and they're now starting to do some implementations. So yes, we're just looking at when we've got the component parts of our own data commons in Australia to see whether some of that architecture might inform how we do that. Now back onto how we might be able to participate. Now, obviously, as I said, Andrew is right onto this, but some of the kinds of services I'd be really keen to tease those out. We operate a whole set of kind of because a research data commons is potentially quite a broad thing, and already those super categories show that a single organization that can span all the way across those things is actually quite a complex organization, even may well be made of separate parts. but there's a whole set of stuff that we certainly do in Australia around what we call information infrastructure. It's kind of, there was an NSF report just recently that talked about knowledge infrastructure. And it's the part all around the standards, identifiers, I suppose, standardized vocabularies as well, semantic infrastructure. There's a whole set of things that we are finding useful at a national level or at a commons level to provide services there, that it'd be nice to have those reflected back into this model. Because it's, again, it's just one of the multiple interesting areas that a commons can provide good value in. And there's again, one of them. Another one is just teasing out how data itself becomes infrastructure as part of a commons. I think there's a well-established model for looking at, let's say, an instrument or a facility as part, or a network as part of an infrastructure. But even though it's not a new idea, data is infrastructure, but actually pulling it off, and especially in an international level, I really think that that's an international data asset that's supported by a number of data commons is a really valuable contribution. So if you're looking at a data collection, what makes a particular data, what's the difference between a data thing and a research data asset, and especially at the international level, there's some really good examples of, I don't know, stuff that comes out of the UN around oceans observing at that global level, and there's quite a lot involved, in the standardization, governance, the community buy-in, the data workflows that all come to make something, rather than the difference between a storage capability of a commons and the data collection capability. And I think we, at RDA, we've got a lot of people with a lot of really good experience and a lot of other working groups as well. But that's another part of this model that I think we can really push forward. I should probably stop. I apologize. It's morning time in Australia, so we're really quite enthusiastic about this. So,
Excuse me, Adrian. I've been trying to make notes of what you've said. If you were able to go back into the notes and perhaps link a reference to the event that you mentioned at the beginning about business-to-business data exchange, that
Sure.
would be great if there's anything you can add. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, and I will just follow up by saying that I think all of your points are really right on the mark, and all of which we would love to capture as this. And just as a reminder, we work under the interest group, and the interest group will be creating a roadmap for the global commons integration. So all the points that you had to make about how data becomes part of a commons, and how can we respectfully integrate the sector and safe data spaces, I think is really good, really on point. And I appreciate you being here. And I don't know if it'll be Andrew or you that actually comes to talk to us about the ARDC, but you're on our commons list. So.
Yeah, well, between Andrew and I'm the director of services, so anything to do with the service catalog type stuff. And then Andrew's our sort of platform software, virtual research environments. But anyway, there's where, again, and I'm saying that from experience, being a commons is quite a complex organization. So you've got people who really know about cloud and high performance computing, and so all of those areas actually can be teased out quite a lot.
There's a note in the chat from Christina. Yeah, and your hand's up, Christina.
Oh, well, the note was just commentary, just a footnote that we are often reminded. I used to work in the NRENs on internet connectivity front, and I think we're building something similar here. So just to note that there may be parallel conversations or lessons learned that we can leverage. But what I just raised my hand on was to note I'm co-chair of the interest group for professionalizing data stewardship here at the RDA. And as we shared earlier today, actually, we have a task group that has been looking at the, we call it the business models for data stewardship, but some of the organizational models of how data is being stewarded, which may overlap with what you're looking at in terms of profiling some of the commons. So it might just be worth connecting offline to see if some of the work that we're doing, there's a survey and a set of research data and vectors on which we're identifying commons. It might map to what you're doing as well.
No, that's interesting. And that could also come under the topology has a human capacity element to it. That if you're professionalizing the RDA, the research data management, that could fit quite nicely.
And we're still working out if we're just talking about research data management, data ethics, data privacy, data governance, et cetera, et cetera. But right now we're trying to tease some of that out.
Anybody else have any thoughts about either where we're going, or does anybody have any questions? I mean, I think one of the things that was really helpful yesterday was getting a set of questions together for what we wanted to ask each of the different commons. And so, for example, one of the questions that came up was, what role do you play as a commons provider? Do you set standards? Do you provide services? Do you do any capacity development or training? There's a whole list of roles that they may or may not provide. How is your governance structure work? Does it work well? How do you decide what services you'll provide? What are the rules? These kinds of questions. So in the rolling notes, and I'm just pulling that back up here, if you do have any, and by the way, if you haven't signed up yet to show that you're here on the session, please do so. So this is the repeat session here in the rolling notes. Am I in the wrong document, Alicia? Because I'm not seeing. I thought you were taking notes and I'm not seeing anything.
I just linked you to it again.
Yeah. Okay, let me try that. Maybe I'm in the wrong notes. Whoops.
Let me just link you to the right header, maybe. There. The second link is the right header.
Yep. And so there's nobody, we haven't put our names in here yet, is what I'm hearing. Is that what you're saying?
No, I gave you the link to the right header within the document, so that you have, because there's 3 sessions on the same document.
Yep, I got
just
that.
to make sure you have the right one.
Great. Okay. What was I looking at? Okay. All right. So one of the things, so if you could imagine that we needed to have a common set of questions for these people that are providing an overview of the commons, with a goal in mind that what we want to do ultimately is provide a roadmap for the integration of these commons. Are there any questions that come to mind that you think we should present to them? I'll leave the floor open for that. Just going through the notes here to see some of the questions that folks had suggested yesterday.
Christina has her hand up.
Oh yeah. Sorry, Christina.
I didn't know I had my hand up. Sorry. I will put that back down.
So,
I did note in the chat though that, being just introduced to this, I feel like I haven't had enough time to review the framework. And, I'd be happy to review, especially since we've been working from the IDS model and to think about where those may overlap. So I'm happy to follow up offline.
I appreciate that, Christina. Thank you. That would be great. Is there anybody on the line here that knows a lot about IVOA already for any reason? Are there any astronomers here online? No, we'll have to leave that to Francoise.
Karen, lots of ideas, but what are there any specific areas of the, I came in a little bit late, so I just caught the tail end of your, the 4 things that you talked about. I just heard you talking about the last one, which was to do with the service catalog type stuff. Would an interview cut across all of those things that you had on the slide there?
I missed that last sentence. I'm sorry.
Would an interview cut? There was one slide where there were 4 big categories of thing that you were talking about. One was, I think, research domain. One was a geolocation. Remind me what the third one was, and the fourth was the service typology. Oh, there was a GORC typology. Is that right?
Yep. So I think that, and I'm gonna share my screen here for a second, and we'll get back to that. So what those were the tags that we've created within the Zotero environment to be able to collect and classify the what we review. And so the idea behind the interviews, or the interviews, or people representing each of the commons that we want to review, the 16 commons that we want to review. I think the idea is that we would want a set of questions that reflect the topology of the commons as we see it. So, how do you manage engagement? Lots of questions that you've already brought up about how do standalone data services become part of a commons? How are you managing integration with other research elements like software? That sort of thing. So these are intended. So what the question I think I'm asking now is, if you were wanting to get a sense of the differences and the commonalities amongst 16 different science commons or research commons, what would you like to ask each of them in turn? And it's likely that it would fall under one of these core or supporting elements.
Okay. Then I would propose, I don't know whether, well, where would we put the conversation? You've texted me in the background about RAID, for example, but a lot of the commons are active in the identifier type space, or the other sort of information infrastructure categories that I talked about, catalogs and standardized vocabularies. Well, you've got some of those in the supporting elements, I suppose, standards and interoperability, but perhaps that's where that would go. I think it's a quite an important role of a commons, or characteristic of it's an opportunity to provide value at the commons level, is a lot of the stuff around information infrastructure. So as long as that would be, so the example, identifiers and services and support, sometimes it's just support for implementation, sometimes it's operating regional nodes of a global sort of identifier infrastructure. You've got the BO6 and others that are running vocabulary services and things like that. So if there was an area to talk about that kind of support.
Yeah. the value add that comes out of the commons, I think, is really important to capture. And I'm sorry, I'm clicking around trying to find, so I will pull up this, and that's part of the reason why we had thought to the services in particular that you talked about in terms of identifiers in the information space, and the things like the Scalex framework for linking information products. I think should be, a lot of that stuff should be reflected in a checklist of these subcategories. And so that's part of why part of the review of the commons that we're going to be doing is asking them which of these do they already adhere to. And there are categories here for training as well. And I would have to pull up, I don't think I've got it in front of me. I would have to pull up the standard, which is here. Putting it in the chat now, that's the EFR standard. And on there, we can find the subcategories that give us at least some idea of the types of services that are being rendered.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but what this doesn't do very well is capture the issues around governance and outreach, I don't think. But for sure. That's interesting. It does cover it there. Any other thoughts on things that we need to know about commons before, if with an idea that we want to create a roadmap for their interoperability going forward? I'm assuming that at some level it would be helpful to gather standards about that, but I realize that that could be a big ask. Looking at all the standards supported by all the services provided by all the commons is quite a big ask, but I think would be really helpful if we could figure out a way to capture that for each of these subcategories, for example. But then I don't know if that's reasonable or not.
The other component that comes up in a lot of the technical architectures is the sort of authorization, authentication.
Yep.
And it has a lot of sort of different instantiations, but from an infrastructure point of view, there are the providers of the different sort of node participants in the shibboleth type federations that exist, and there's certainly an enabling factor in everything else. And then when you go to look at the architecture of a data sort of access environment, then it's always one of the first things that sort of says, okay, well, how do we facilitate access through sort of categories and groups and researchers, and then and that becomes important with the industry partners that says, okay, if it's easy for researchers to be authorized to participate, then that makes it difficult sometimes for other groups, or that they're not difficult, but there's just not necessarily the same kind of frameworks. I don't know whether that's part of your standard set of functions for a commons.
It certainly is. Security and identity is the large umbrella, and then the authentication and identity management, all of that certainly is very much a part of it. I don't see how the commons work without it, for sure. Yeah. I might want to circle back though. You said, Adrian, you said something interesting. I wondered if, because you were saying that you were developing your data spaces within the ARDC. Are you developing them to support data visitation to as well as data distribution? Is that something that you're working on?
Visitation in the sense of like a federated access type thing, or
access in terms of accepting software packages to run analyses on data in place? as opposed to distributing data out to analysis.
Look, we haven't got a specific what do you call recommended or even supported approach either way, whether it's visitation or sort of download access or other types of things there. We probably haven't. We've got a number of preparatory projects, probably about 50 of them now, that are meant to inform our next step, which is probably 4 or 5 much bigger, like the clusters in the Eos idea. So that's where we're at the moment, and we would certainly want, and certainly in the health space, that's becoming more and more. If we do if one of those big 4 clusters is a health one, then by default we'll have to be able to support that kind of thing. So we don't necessarily. We've got a couple of sort of Pathfinder projects with a number of sort of either secure e-research type platforms or more formally the sort of data visitation type thing. But so no, we don't have a mature, I wouldn't say we've got a mature capability that we could just keep rolling out or build on in that area, but we certainly part of the capability that we want to build into a health thematic data commons that we're right in the middle of scoping now, which is why we're sort of reaching out to the IDSA view for some of that more trusted access type thing.
Yep. Yeah. And
certainly from what I understand of the data spaces, that's a lot of it is that kind of thing where a car manufacturer is not providing its whole inventory out to the world, but to selected players they're allowing particular types of data visitation.
Yeah, and what's going to be interesting is how the existing data repositories choose to do that, whether or not they become part of an organization where they provide data and the access is provided by a different infrastructure, or if they build out their own infrastructure to allow for that to happen on their existing platforms. That's going to be an interesting question going forward and how they choose to do that. It looks like, Christina, you're dropping some more resources here. Is that what I'm seeing?
Yeah, that's what's in the chat. We've been going down this path for the Data Trust project I'm on over the past 2 years. And in addition to the international data spaces, there are some other efforts where they've been cataloging these commons, often looking to pull in data from the private sector for research purposes. And so the entire body of knowledge around data collaboratives and data institutions may be of use. So just kind of flagging a couple key resources and players there.
Yep.
I think that goes back to a scoping question I had. I wasn't sure with respect to this if you had started with a scope that it had to be purely open data, or if you were looking like, one of the things that international data spaces is it plays in that gray space where you can exchange and steward data that is both open and that is sensitive or controlled or privileged. So thinking about proprietary data that may be made available for research. And here in the US, one of the great models is the National COVID Cohort Collaborative that was pulled together. So there's the sharing of proprietary pharmaceutical research data by some of the companies, as well as some of the open research data. So just as a footnote.
I mean, I definitely think that the commons have to be, well, it depends on the commons. Some will be entirely open, but there are commons that are developing the ability to manage both open data and secured or restricted data as well. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. certainly not and health is the most obvious and necessary driving factor for that, the health data, but also archaeological sites and indigenous knowledge can be quite sensitive as well. So there's other use cases for that. Yeah, for sure. Is there anybody else on the line that wants to weigh in here and tell? And you can tell me if we're going down a bad path, if we're going the wrong way. Okay. At this point, unless there's other topics that we need to address, I might give you back a half hour in your day and ask you to please put any questions that you might think that we need to consider for Commons in the chat window, and we will definitely take all of your resources that you provided to us and add them to our Zotero and include them. I do appreciate that. I'm certainly not up on a lot of the stuff that's going on. Especially, I do think there's a number of developments or ideas about creating a commons in the US that I have not seen before. The NIH was one of the original data commons that was really quite well done. But I didn't know of a pan-US commons. But if my understanding is correct, that there's a lot of conversations about that going on right now. Well, hopefully, maybe one day we'll have RDA in person, and these conversations will be a bit easier to manage when my laptop's not hanging on by a thread and I get a camera back and we're back in business. But I appreciate all of you taking time to join us today. There is going to be a third repeat of this, so it'll be the exact same content. So, but if you have any European colleagues that you think might be interested, please let them know. But other than that, I really appreciate it. And yeah, thanks for coming by, and I hope to see you in the RDA groups going forward. Great, guys. Bye.
Thanks very much. Ta-ra.